Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to randyrhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
For a commercial-free, on-demand, whenever, wherever listening experience, visit randyrhodes.com for your personal premium podcast today.
Here, listen to this. This is a little snippet of Steve Bannon's radio show.
Mr. Trump, we had Dr. Carson on earlier talking about his trip to Syria, but we started the show with our live reporters in Turkey, London, Paris, Rome, etc., talking about this fracas right now between Putin and Erdogan. The BBC, we've talked about this 10 days ago on Breitbart, and our listeners about Turkey making money off of ISIS oil, that one of the revenue streams, major revenue streams, is oil, as you've talked about. Turkey's been the middleman. Putin now, finally, 9 days after it's up on Breitbart, BBC lead story, Putin saying, hey, we got a problem here. Turkey's the middleman and making plenty of cash off ISIS and has skin in the game, keeping ISIS around. Erdogan immediately goes back and says, hey, you can prove it, I'll step down. If your plan in prosecuting this war as commander-in-chief of the United States, if you're elected president, in prosecuting the war, what do you do with Turkey? Is Turkey a reliable partner? I know they're a NATO ally. Are they a reliable partner?
Well, I have a little conflict of interest because I have a major building in Istanbul, and it's a tremendously successful job. It's called Trump Towers, 2 towers instead of 1. Not the usual 1, it's 2. And I've gotten to know Turkey very well, and they're amazing people. They're incredible people. They have a strong leader.
So even his own crony, Steve Bannon, says Turkey is making money off of ISIS oil. Who knows if any of what he, but the reaction to that news, whether it's fake or real, the reaction to that news for Donald Trump is ISIS schmisis. I have buildings in Turkey, and I got to protect my business. So I invited Professor Richard Wolff on the show. As I told you, he's, Harvard, Yale, twice, Stanford, the whole 9 yards. Used to teach at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and now is in at the New School in New York, which is a fabulous school. I told you I went there for one semester. And I invited you on. Hi, Richard. Nice to meet you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm glad you're on the phone because I invited you to discuss the populist rhetoric that Donald Trump was spewing versus the reality of Donald Trump.
Well, I'd be glad to.
Thank you.
Kind of hard to know where to start.
I know.
The gap is so staggering.
Well, let me get you started. I think, look, capitalism, unbridled, unregulated, deregulated, unleashed in its purest form, hurt so many people in this country. And Donald Trump was out there pretending that, even though he lives on the 58th floor in a triplex in Manhattan, that he understood the plight of coal country. And
that's right. It just tells you how desperate the people of America, the mass of the people of America are at this point, that they want so badly to have a change in an economic system that is really screwing them and screwing their children in a major way, that they would even stop and take seriously this out-of-control billionaire, playboy, New Yorker, in the worst sense of those words. That's how desperate. It's a sign of desperation that you have a guy who sits square in the middle of the top 1% or 1/100th of 1% as a credible candidate. It shows you how badly the system is dysfunctioning for the mass of people that they would even take that serious.
Yeah, and Hillary wasn't, reading her white papers on the campaign trail. She was running basically against him, and people didn't understand that she did have a different plan, which would have been better, but it was a middle way, and that's always the problem, isn't it? Just going.
Yeah, and I think she was also very badly hampered by deciding, which was a mystery to me when she did it, but she did it, that she was going to be the continuation of the great success of the Obama administration. That was not a success for the mass of people. Whatever you thought of Mr. Obama when he came in, promising, by the way, the same sort of hope and change that Mr. Trump, now in a kind of mockery, used to get himself into office, showing that people really want change. But Mrs. Clinton presented herself as pretty much more of the same, and that was the kiss of death, in my judgment, because the American people, even if they liked her on other grounds, wanted the change that she simply did not project as something she could or would do.
Yeah, it was missing. A lot of people, I paid very, very close attention to it. I'm sure you did too. But there was so many people that just didn't hear her saying anything that, related to making their lot in life better. They didn't hear that she was saying, pre-K for 4-year-olds. They didn't hear her saying biggest investment in infrastructure since World War II. They didn't hear her saying, college tuition in public universities free for everybody under 250. I mean, she just didn't stress that. The way she ran was against him, and there was so much wrong with him that it's kind of tempting to do it, but he baited her into making her whole campaign trashing him, and people
and even worse than that, Ricky, if I could interject, she kept portraying him as really different, as weird, as abnormal, as not even a conventional Republican, as being beyond the pale. She didn't understand that the American people wanted something radically different from what was happening to them. And the more she painted him as really different, the more she made his case for him. It was a kind of bizarre watching, like being on a train in slow motion as it heads into a stone wall, and you want to shout at the people, get out, stop the train, because you're heading for doom this way. I remember thinking, my goodness, who's advising her to portray herself in this way and to portray him? And then when you finish up by calling all the people that are rallying around him, who really want the kind of change that she could have been better at than he ever would be,
right,
then she calls them all bad names like a deplorables, and she seals her own doom in this process. It's remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, and then he, but what's really remarkable is how he's walking around saying he's going to drink. I mean, the verbiage was, right out of Frank Luntz's playbook. It was amazingly good language if you really wanted anything different than what you were waking up to every single day. The Make America Great Again, and then they become a hashtag.
And to thumb his nose at all the establishments, to kind of be the naughty boy who says the unsayable and has the courage to portray that he is going to overthrow the old stodgy establishments, first in the Republican Party and now in the Democratic Party. He's the little play actor, faking it all the way through in this little psychodrama, and that people are so upset that they will actually imagine that this clownish character, whose economic policies, if you want to discuss that,
I do,
are really bizarre, strange things, where the chances of them working to help the average American are 1 in a million. You'd be better off betting on lottery tickets than this. This is crazy, but it is also a sign that the American situation is dire, that people would be so desperate as to vote for this.
Yeah, I hear you. I really do. And so, when he started talking about draining the swamp, it was just so he didn't, he's not going to drain the swamp. The swamp now has a concierge, is what it is. So,
right. Well, let's start, if we could. Let's start with a couple of the economic policies that he is touting. Let me start with getting rid of expelling or deporting 3 or more million immigrants, undocumented immigrants.
What impact would that have on our economy, Professor Wolff?
Well, most of them would be awful. But even before we get into them, there is something so bizarre about this that I really have to say it. Here is a man who literally embodies all of the arrogance of the 1%, the richest people in America, who is telling all of us that the way to solve our economic problems is to really whack the bottom 1%. Undocumented immigrants are people at the very bottom of the pyramid of our society. They're people who don't get paid properly, who often don't even get paid the money they're owed, low as their wages are, because the unscrupulous employer knows very well that the undocumented immigrant can't go to the police, can't go to any government authority to get their injustice corrected because they don't have the documents, etc., etc. These are the most oppressed, exploited people in our society. So we're being told by a man from the 1% at the top that what we need to fix our society is to really hurt the 1% at the bottom. There is something so indecent, so unethical, so unchristian, if I may say so, about this, that it kind of boggles the mind that we live in a time where you could get away with this. But having said that, let's take a look at what happens. If you actually did this, if you threw out of the country these very poor 3, 5, 10 million, whatever it is, of undocumented immigrants, let's go through what's going to happen.
Okay.
First, those millions of people were spending money, buying clothing, buying food, renting apartments, driving cars. They're not going to be doing any of those things anymore, so that all kinds of businesses that depended on their customers being these people are going to go out of business. That's the first thing.
Okay.
The second thing, millions of businesses, large and small in America, employed these people, particularly in the fields of construction, in the fields of retail trade, in the fields of large institutional administrations like hospitals and so on. They took advantage of these low-wage workers and hired them. They're now going to lose their workers. And if they look around for other people, they're going to discover that people who are not undocumented immigrants do not have to submit to the treatment that they had gotten, do not accept and will not accept low wages the way undocumented immigrants have no choice but to do. And so all these businesses are going to discover that the wage costs of the people they use to replace the deported undocumented immigrant are going to be much higher. For many of them, they may not be able to survive their businesses if they have to pay proper wages. For many others, they will survive, but you can bet they're going to pass on the cost of higher wages in the form of higher prices to the rest of us to pay for the services of those now deported undocumented immigrants. It's going to therefore boost the price level in the United States, and it's going to create all kinds of difficulties as we work through the economic costs of all of this. And I want to stress that the problems we've had in the last 30 to 40 years of this economy, which are now coming to a head, have very little to do with immigration.
Right.
And even if you believe that immigration is in some way unfair or inappropriate, it is not the appropriate target to solve our problems because it's going to have all of these unwanted negative effects on all of us to sort of kick these folks out. And now a last point. Immigrants mainly come here because the economies in which they were born and raised are unlivable. It's a very traumatic event to leave your home country, the language, the neighborhoods, the communities that you grew up in, where your family and your relatives and your friends are, and to go to another country where you never really know what kind of welcome you're going to get. You're going to have to learn a new language, new ways of function. It's scary and it's difficult, and people don't do it unless they are in real tough shape. Try to imagine, let me ask your audience, to imagine with me a country as shaky as Mexico, which is where many of these undocumented immigrants will be sent if Trump carries through with his threats. This is a country that barely survives now. There are large parts of Mexico into which the Mexican army cannot go because of the drug gangs and the drug business that has taken over huge parts of that country. There is no work that the millions of people that Mr. Trump will deport to Mexico, if he carries it through, there's no work for them there. There's no housing for them there. What in the world are you asking the Mexicans to do with these people they cannot accommodate, which is why they left to go to the United States in the first place? You're going to have a failed state on your border, your southern border. Do you want that here in the United States? Those people will end up working in the drug business because there is no other way to survive for millions of them. We're talking about unleashing changes that no rational person would pursue. So I have to believe that Mr. Trump used it to get elected, will either not go through with it, or he will cause a whirlwind if he tries, from which it'll take us a long time to recover.
Yeah, and I've always argued that our best interests, and when you talk about you want to be president, you have to put America's interests in the fore. And so our best interest is a prosperous Mexico, so we don't have a failed state on our border. And I've always argued that. It doesn't make any other sense. It doesn't make any sense any other way around. That's why we do trade deals. You want Mexico to do well so that you don't have to build walls. And that's
right. And if you really mean what he said, and you're not going to allow low immigrants to come in here, as we have done as a nation throughout the history of the United States, if you're going to close it off, you're not going to allow immigrants to come here, and you're going to have this, what he claims, the result is that Americans will get jobs that immigrants once got. Well, I can assure you that if Americans take those jobs, they're going to demand the kinds of salaries that American natives are used to. And when corporations discover that they now have a higher wage bill to pay for the people that are not undocumented immigrants, to whom they have to actually pay the going wage rates, et cetera, you know what's going to happen? Because that's how our economic system works. More and more companies are going to think about going abroad, because if you can't bring the low-wage worker here, you go to where the low-wage worker is.
Right, and that's what businesses are doing. They're shopping around the globe to find the lowest-waged worker they can find.
And if you shut that off, either the immigrant way of getting it or the globalization going out there to the rest of the world to get it, then the last thing that the employer will do is substitute a computer or a robot for you. You're living in a system that works this way, and all Mr. Trump is saying is, I'm going to solve your problem by closing off one of the ways capitalists make profit. And the silly thing about it is that capitalists have other ways of making profit that are just as bad for the mass of people. He's just playing kind of musical chairs among the different strategies that capitalists have, and hoping that people don't pay enough attention to see through the phoniness, the ineffectiveness of what he proposed.
Now, so now you've identified that he's gone after the bottom 1%, the least of us, the really vulnerable, the fleeing, the people who are, trying to get out of violence and abject poverty, and they come here. Okay, but isn't the reason for the unhappiness, for the anger, actually, in this country, isn't that a result of stagnant wages?
Absolutely. It's a result of not only stagnant wages, but let me make it as stark as I can.
Yeah.
In economics, we have this term we call, in the profession, real wages. And all that means is you adjust the wages people are getting for the prices they have to pay. In other words, it really doesn't help you to get 10% increase in your money wage. If the prices of everything you buy have gone up by 10%, you end up with not a nickel more than you had before, because your extra money in your pocket is having to be spent to pay the higher prices for what you buy. If you compare the real wage that the American worker on average got in 1978 to what the average worker in America gets today in 2016, it was higher then than it is now. In other words, we haven't increased what an average worker can get with what he or she earns in an average hour of their labor over the last 40 years. Now, during that time, workers became more and more productive. They had more machines, better computers, more training, had to work harder and faster. The end result is, over these 40 years, workers became more productive, which simply means they produced more for the employer for every hour that they worked. Meanwhile, the employer didn't give them more for every hour that they worked. The wages were stagnant to slightly declining, while their productivity went up. Well, there's the explanation for why the gap between rich and poor went crazy over the last 40 years. Because all of the extra production that workers were able to do went to their employers, who gave them no increase in wages as a result over the same period of time. That's the root of the economic problems we have, of the inequality we have. The rich became wildly richer, and knowing that our political system could always undo that, they turned to spend their money to buy the political parties. You see the whole evolution of our society coming out of these stagnant wages with rising productivity. To then turn around and blame the immigrant for all of this, when the immigrants had zippity-doo to do with it, is the kind of flim-flam, card-sharp maneuver that got Trump this victory.
And then, you look at the fact that, productivity goes up because we're being forced to do the jobs of 5 people now. Each person, right. And all of this benefits the very top 1% of the corporation or the top 1% of the economy. And then on top of it, you give this sort of a fake feeling of having money by extending credit to those workers whose money has stayed stagnant, has stayed the same, even though their productivity goes up, but the cost of things are going up at the same time, and it's pretty much a wash. So you say to them, all right, here's what we're going to do. Borrow against your house. Borrow at 30% on a credit card. Borrow. And that went on for years, didn't it?
Exactly. Look, there's a kind of tragedy here. You can almost cry when you understand it. You give the American working class this idea that we have an American dream that we're somehow entitled to, that if we work hard and we study hard and we apply ourselves and all the rest of it, we will do better than the generation before us, and our children will do better than we will, and all the rest.
Right.
And then, and it's true for a while, the 19th century and in the early half of the 20th century, you could make a case that things went pretty well. There are a lot of reasons for that, but what we do know is in the 1970s, it stopped. The wages stopped going up as corporations decided they could do better by moving production out of the country. They could do better by substituting machines and computers for people and all the rest of it. They are free in our free enterprise society to do that. They don't have to pay for the consequences, no matter how horrible they are. And now we have what? A working class which has been led to believe it's entitled to a rising standard of living, that where husbands and wives promise each other a rising standard of living, where they promise it to their children even more, that they will have an education, that they will get a good job, and suddenly the wages don't go up to pay for it all. Well, it's not surprising that the working class with those expectations, without the wages to pay for it, would turn to the only other way to get that done, and that's to borrow money. And the banks were all too willing to lend them, as you put it, at the very, very high credit card rates, whether it be for their homes or their credit cards or their automobiles. And then this new invention of the last 20 years, which is to plunge college students into a lifetime of debt peonage by making a college education require them to go tens of thousands of dollars into debt. It is a criminal experience for the American working class to be more and more pressured into debt anxiety on top of the fact that their wages are going nowhere. Of course they're upset. Of course they want change. And of course they're going to turn to politicians who seem to offer even the slimmest hope. We were all surprised, I believe, or most of us were, when in 2008, a young African-American person, Barack Obama, could actually claim to be a credible candidate for president in a country that had never elected an African-American to such a job. And I think he won in large part because he got across the idea that he was going to give you hope for real change. So people overcame whatever held them back about voting for African Americans and did it. And when they felt now that they hadn't gotten the change that they had hoped for from Mr. Obama, well, they were then prepared to go even further out on a limb for some credible hope for change. I don't think Trump merits it. I don't think Trump will fix their situation, probably make it much worse. But I see it all as a sign of a system that is really in an extreme bad situation, provoking its own people into a more and more desperate search for anything that will get them out of the way this system is working.
Yeah, and so they just vote for different now because they know that
right.
things can't stay the same. So, I appreciate that. But before you go, he's talking about this infrastructure package.
Right.
The way he's doing it is kind of tax credits for businesses. It doesn't seem like a real government investment with real wages, with real labor. It seems like it's just going to be a giveaway, and then you'll end up with a toll road. Am I wrong about that? Should I?
No, you're absolutely right. The very proposals he's made fall far short of anything like a major jobs program of the sort this broken economy needs, number one. Number two, he has to get it through a Republican Party that dominates the Congress, that has, at least for the last 30 years, blocked, stopped this kind of program. So my guess is there'll have to be some sort of compromise between the already inadequate program Trump proposes and the one that the Republicans will let through in their domination of the Congress. And then you're right. Much of this has to do with very profitable contracts to construction companies, much of whose work is now done in an automatic way by big machines, not by hiring large numbers of workers. Yeah, this is going to be what I suspect much of the Trump administration will be. Lots of symbolism, lots of hype, but when you get right down to it, the number of jobs and the impact on the conditions of working people are likely to be very, very poor, if not negative. And here's a real risk with the infrastructure, a last point.
Okay.
The Republicans may very well say, okay, we will give you the infrastructure program you want, but we're not going to raise taxes on anybody to pay for it, and therefore we don't want to borrow either, because we've been telling our constituents that the deficit is the biggest problem in the world for 40 years, so we won't borrow to pay for the infrastructure, and we won't raise taxes. Well, then the only way left to fund an infrastructure program is to take the money away from other programs, like lending to students, like food stamps, like all the other things which a Republican majority Congress has been gunning for years anyway. So the working class may well discover a small number of jobs created in a infrastructure program paid for by a decimation of the public services that American working people need now more than ever.
Well, there are two things that Trump has said, and of course he's, on any subject, there are always more than two things that he has said. And on this particular issue of borrowing, he has said too many things, so I don't know where he is. He had said that, he was on CNBC one day. Nobody watches that except you and me. And he said, well, they asked him, what's the proper, a debt to GDP ratio for you? What would you like? And he didn't know what they were talking about. So he said, well, what I can tell you is the asset that we have is low interest rates. The interest rates are so low that to not borrow would be malpractice. He said, you must borrow. You have to borrow. So I know that somewhere in his head, it's always about other people's money, and he's thinking of borrowing. The other side of the coin might be the Republicans would like to be able to tell the American people they lowered taxes. And in that vein, they might be able to sell people, especially undereducated people, I hate to say it that way, but people that don't pay attention so closely, that what they'll do is they'll repatriate all this money that's offshore, and they'll bring it in at 10%, and that money will be used for the infrastructure project. Is that viable?
No, let me explain very quickly.
Yeah.
It's so sad when that kind of argument is used. It makes my blood boil. Here's the law. The American big corporations, if they can show that they earned their money abroad, and if they put it into a bank account abroad rather than bring it home, thereby don't have to pay income taxes here in the United States.
Right.
By the way, many other countries do not permit corporations to do that. So we're not doing something that's normal practice. We're doing something that American corporations have gotten their government to do when many others don't. Having said that, when the American company puts their profits in a bank overseas and therefore, quote unquote, doesn't bring it home, there is nothing to prevent them from using the money in that account to do all kinds of things around the world, to invest here and there. To think that that money is just sitting there and has not been profitably invested by those companies, is to not understand how the financial system works. So you're not going to, for example, they can use that money over there to buy shares in an American company through the foreign stock exchange, and therefore move their money back into the United States through the account over there. That's all perfectly legal and still avoids them having to pay taxes. So they're not going to be doing anything big and different if you allow them to bring the money back into the country directly, because they've been doing it all indirectly.
And basically any penny they bring back, even if it's a low tax rate of 10%, is still 10% more than they're paying, and they can invest in America, through the stock market.
Yes, they always could, and therefore if you allow them to bring it back by giving them a lower tax rate, you've given them the whole game away. They only brought up all of this. They only went through that indirect route to escape taxes.
Right.
And if the response of the American government is, okay, well then we'll lower the taxes, you're inviting them to do that every 5 years. Indeed, they did it, and back in 2004,
right,
we did this. We lowered the taxes, and we had all these promises. Now the money will come back into the United States, and it will produce an investment bonanza.
And
well,
what did they buy, Professor Wolff?
There was no investment bonanza. That's why.
No, they bought shares in their own companies.
Yes, and they boosted their salaries. Because what people don't remember is when you cut the taxes for a corporation, all that means is money they used to give to the government, they now keep. What they will do with that money is their decision. They don't have to hire people with it. They can pay their executives more. They can build a factory in another country. Right. They can lend it to the U.S. government or another government. There is no one-to-one relationship between cutting the tax on a business and producing a job. That's why it's so phony when companies say, cut taxes on us and it will increase jobs. No, it won't. You cut taxes on business, that's what you've done. You've given them more money, but you haven't controlled in any way what they do with that money. And we've seen already historically that give them a tax cut and they will find wonderful ways for them to use the money other than creating jobs. And if you were really serious, a government that really represented us as people would say to them, we will give you a tax cut if and only if you use the money that you don't have to pay in taxes anymore to create at least X thousand jobs. If you really wanted to do what they claim they may do if you cut their taxes, then make that part of the law, and then you wouldn't have this sad situation of being told how cutting taxes will produce jobs, seeing it never result in that, and then having the nerve to tell us that again now.
Hey, it's unbelievable. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Professor Richard Wolff. You can find him on Twitter at Prof. Wolff with 2 Fs, and he's got his own website, richardwolff.com. You're awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we reached out and that you accepted. Thank you.
Thank you. It'll be my pleasure. If you want to do it again, I'd love to talk with you.
Most definitely. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Love him because he's as plain-spoken as I am. And yet, he went to Yale twice, and Stanford, and Harvard, and I didn't. So there's some street cred for you, okay? Go look him up. He's got amazing work out there. Professor Richard Wolff with 2 Fs. Awesome. 5 o'clock.
The Randi Rhodes Air Force. The Randi Rhodes Show is live on RandiRhodes.com and the free Progressive Voices app for Android and iOS. Visit the App Store or ProgressiveVoices.com now.
Hi, we're back, and everything is possible again. Isn't it beautiful? Well, if you want to keep it this way, buy a stinking podcast. Oh yes, you have to buy a stinking podcast. And you get that at RandiRhodes.com, where we're open all day, all night long. RandiRhodes.com. Get your stinking podcast. Go to RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.